One in Three is intended for mature audiences. Episodes contain explicit content and may be triggering as they often include violence and other varying forms of abuse such as emotional, psychological, sexual, and physical. In most cases, names have been changed to protect all involved. Please note, statements and opinions of guests do not necessarily reflect those of my own. Hi, warriors. Welcome to One in Three. I'm your host, Ingrid. Sexual assault, sexual violence, and rape are topics many people shy away from. Let's be honest, the same is often true of domestic violence. These issues can run parallel to each other and at times overlap. Today's guest helps us unpack the realities of sexual violence, what it is, how it's defined, its lasting impact it has on survivors, the role of perpetrators, and equally important, what can and is being done to create change. Please welcome Tracy, LCSW and CEO of Callisto. Hi, Tracy. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we jump into our conversation, do you mind giving a little bit of a background just so listeners can get to know you a little?
Yeah, I would love to. So my name is Tracy DeTomasi, and I am the CEO of Callisto. We are a national nonprofit that has built technology to help survivors of sexual violence. And I will get into that a little bit later as to what we do. But I am a licensed clinical social worker, and I have been doing gender-based violence work for 25 years now. I actually started my career as a therapist for adolescent sex offenders, and so I've worked a lot with both offenders, perpetrators, and victims and survivors. I worked in group homes for about 15 years with adolescents, mostly boys, but I also worked with victims of child victims of sex trafficking, and I ran a domestic violence shelter, and I've also helped with global campaigns about getting awareness about domestic violence and sexual assault. So it's something that I'm really passionate about, and I've been doing a long time. When Me Too happened, I had been doing it for 18 years, and it was definitely a watershed moment that changed the conversation. But I am just really happy to be here and to be able to talk more about this issue that a lot of people don't want to talk about, and to tell your listeners more about Callisto as well.
Okay, so loads and loads of experience and expertise to be talking about this topic. So sexual violence, obviously, it can be a form of domestic violence. It's not always a domestic violence situation, but could you just define sexual violence? There's a lot of myths, misconceptions regarding that, the act, the victims, lots of stuff there.
That's a great question. I think that is one of the problems in this field is that we all have different definitions of what they are, and there's legal definitions of sexual assault. Those legal definitions vary by state and by jurisdiction, and then there's kind of a general societal definition of a lot of these things. So how I define sexual violence is really the umbrella term of anything that happens to your person without consent, and that can be physical or non-physical. So sexual violence can be the unwanted sharing of photos, of nude photos, or deep fake pornography. It can be child sexual abuse material. It can be rape. It can be incest. It can be coercion. It can be a lot of those things. And then sexual assault is really an umbrella term for anything physical. So it can be groping. It can be touching. It can be rape. It can be molestation. A lot of people use sexual assault and rape interchangeably, and they're not. While rape is sexual assault isn't always rape. And that is because sexual assault is more of that umbrella term. And so I'm really glad that you started with the definition because, again, I think that we use these terms, and a lot of times, with creators and podcasts and stuff, we use SA or we use sexual assault because rape doesn't get through the filters. And rape is a word that is really harsh to people. And so we have toned it down to say sexual assault because people can't handle the word rape, which is why that word isn't used as much.
I have found that quite a lot is the difficulty in using the word rape. Do you think that and I just thought of this question on the fly. Do you think that actually using the term rape, do you feel like that gives any extra sense of empowerment? Like if a victim were to actually be able to say, I was raped versus that person sexually assaulted me?
I think it can. I don't think it does for all survivors, but I do know that there are many survivors that when they are finally able to say, this person raped me, it can be really, really empowering, because I think the other interesting thing with language is that, and Jackson Katz has a probably 10 to 15-year-old TED talk about this that's brilliant, is we have pacified our language. So I was sexually assaulted versus he sexually assaulted or he raped me. But I do think that there are a lot of people who have been assaulted that can't say the word. They're not ready for it. It means something different. There's a weakness about it. There shouldn't be, but there's a shame about that happens. And so I think that people really struggle with that. And so sometimes it's easier to say, I've been sexually assaulted, or even that person sexually assaulted me, versus saying the word rape, because there's a different connotation around that. I think that part of that is about how we view rapists. And I do a lot of talks about this where we talk about, we think rapists are either really good or really bad. Like we think people are really good or really bad, and rapists are in that really bad category. When in reality, rapists are both. They're really good people and they're really bad people who've done really bad things. And so a lot of survivors, particularly if they know the person, which 80 to 90% of survivors know who assaulted them. If they know that person, it's hard to reconcile the fact that they're a rapist. And so I think that us not wanting to label the perpetrator as a rapist or even a perpetrator changes what victims and survivors feel like, if it's their family member, if it's their significant other, if it's somebody that they've admired, a coach or a teacher for a long time, and they can't reconcile that. And I also think that the response that they get from other people, if they say this person raped me versus this person sexually assaulted me, a lot of person are like, are you calling them a rapist? Well, yes, but they're more willing to say, like, they're they're more willing to be empathetic if a person says, I was sexually assaulted, rather than naming that perpetrator. And we need to change that. That is really, really problematic. And we absolutely need to change that. So I think that is a brilliant question.
Yeah, I have become, I've noticed for some reason this year specifically, personally, more sensitive, I guess, to the use of certain words and terminology, especially with media, when media is reporting. So for instance, if there is a victim who is murdered by their abuser, it is an altercation, or it's some sort of level of where perhaps the victim had something to do with the fact that they were murdered. But if it was a stranger, it's, murder in cold blood. And
Yep.
So like saying I was sexually assaulted or I was raped by that individual, it almost is taking some sort of sense of ownership. And I don't think that individual necessarily is saying it's my fault, but victim blaming is a huge thing. And it almost, and again, I don't want to say this in a way of, a victim is wrong by using whatever verbal, oh my gosh, I can't talk, whatever words they want to use. But it's almost like that opens a door of somebody being able to say, well, okay, you were sexually assaulted by that person. Why? What did you do to
Right.
become assaulted? So victim blaming is a huge, huge aspect
Yeah,
of sexual violence and rape.
absolutely. And I think that I typically use the words victim and survivor interchangeably, because I think that, there's a lot of survivors who say, I don't want to feel like a victim, because I think in our society we have put what that word means is that you're weak and you didn't fight back. So a lot of people over the years that through a healing journey have used the word survivors. And in the past, victims is typically used in the criminal justice system. And so there was referred to as victims, but there is this movement of certain people that that were assaulted that are using the word victim because it shows what happened to them and not who they are. Or even not even naming it as a verb. I am not a victim. Somebody assaulted me. He assaulted me. And using that person first language to say, this is what happened to me, and I am not defined by it at all, either way. But that is every survivor or victim's choice. If something's happened to you and you find power in that, that is the word that you should use. And whatever helps your healing is exactly what you should do. And I think that in 10, 20, 30 years, it's going to look different. And that's great. We need to evolve. Language evolves and our understanding evolves. And so, there is no judgment to any person who uses survivor or victim or thriver or whatnot. But I think that as a society, we can see how we have put we've taken often the perpetrator out of the equation. Survivor of sexual violence, battered women. We are taking the perpetrator completely out of the equation, and I think we need to add that person back in.
I so agree with that. And so, speaking of perpetrators, you and I talked about this before we had recorded the aspect of marital rape and how it's recognized in the country. But again, you had mentioned also this time how states vary in proof, what levels are needed to determine if it is considered marital rape. Could we just talk briefly? I don't know how much information there is on actually marital rape, but just a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are really confused by that of like, how do you rape your spouse? But I think that it happens all the time. And I'm not talking about like, I just wasn't really in the mood but it's fine. I'll let him or her do it. Like that is not what we're talking about. And I think that because a lot of people have that experience, that is something different. While you should still want your partner to be enthusiastic every time, we know that that's not the case in, every time when you're married, right? But what I'm talking about, and it doesn't have to be violent, it can just be a source of control. It can be violent. But I think that happens a lot more in marriages. And like you said, the courts didn't recognize it for a very long time. And I don't think it's illegal in every state. And I think in some states, they're probably even trying to push those laws back. But it's really, really confusing to victims because we don't talk about that enough to have experienced that and say, this is not okay, but this is my partner, this is my spouse who loves me, or supposedly loves me, and I'm still experiencing this thing that I don't want to experience, and then nobody believes me because they're thinking about it as like just let it happen. You're married. We all don't want to all the time. We're not in the mood. And it's not about the thing about sexual assault in general, no matter how it happens, it's not about sex. It's about power and control. And so when sexual assault and marital rape happen, it's about power of one spouse over the other. That's what it's about. It is not about getting your sexual needs met at all. It's about the power that you are having over your spouse.
Well, and that bleeds into like teenage sexual violence and rape, where there is, perhaps not a lot of education in terms of the victim, where they truly understand that, no, I'm not obligated to engage in any kind of sexual activity that I don't want to. But then you get thrown in well, if you really loved me or if you really cared for me, this is what you would do. And then there's more of a coercion aspect into engaging in whatever sexual activity.
Absolutely. I think that there's such a overlap of dating violence, and we don't have good words for it because, in the field, we say dating violence for teens and for, college age folks, but they don't ever say that they were a victim of dating violence. They might say that they were in a toxic relationship or an unhealthy relationship, or that they were just in a relationship. They don't see it as dating violence or anything, because you're right. A lot of it is coercion, and our media has set that up to be okay. If you look at, especially, I'm a Gen Xer, and you look at a lot of Harrison Ford movies, including Star Wars. It was he pressured her, pressured her, pressured her. She's against a wall when him and Princess Leia have their first kiss, and that's romantic. And in the end, that gets him to get the girl. And I think back to one of my favorite movies as a kid, and Say Anything. And John Cusack Lloyd Dobler holds the stereo above his head, and I had that poster on my wall, and it's stalking. If she said no, it's a no. But in the end, it's like that's the love stories that we were brought up with. And I think that there is so much pressure. And I think that we have, it's the no, I don't want to. I don't think so. I'm not ready. And then it's like, come on, come on, come on. If you're pressuring somebody to do that, that's a form of assault. That is a form of rape. That is a form of sexual assault. And I don't think that when we teach consent, we teach people how to say no. That is not the problem. We're not teaching people how not to coerce. We're teaching them maybe how not to physically be violent against somebody, but we're not teaching them how not to coerce somebody and to convince them that what they're doing is okay. And I think that starts, especially in this new generation, of sending naked pictures and pressuring youth and significant others to send photos that they're not ready for.
That I'm so glad you brought that up because that is a huge thing. And again, it's perhaps, I mentioned of a lack of education for the victim of not, necessarily feeling comfortable with saying no, or I'm not going to be coerced into that. But there is also a lack of education in if they say no, it's not something you need to convince them to, or like, she didn't seem willing, but she just needed to know that I was really going to be there for her. I was, that's all part of it. And it is romanticized, especially I'm also Gen X for sure. All of that was romanticized of, well, I don't really want to do this, but he's so persistent. So he must really care for me. So, okay, I guess I feel okay doing this now.
Yeah. I've talked to a lot of men over the years because I developed and ran a program that got men involved in ending violence against women. And I would always get the question about like, well, what if she's playing hard to get? And I'm like, then don't get her. Like that's the thing, is that she's not worth your time, because what if you're wrong and she's saying no and she isn't playing hard to get and she's just saying no? Then that's on you. That's on you. So as women, we need to stop playing hard to get. We need to say what we want. And I think that, that we could get into a million conversations about our society's ability to talk about sex and not shame sex. And I think that, positive sex culture and positive sexuality is a big prevention for sexual assault, because then we know how to talk about it. We know what we like. We can express what we like. We can say things that like, oh, I don't like that. And we can have our partner also respect that and know those boundaries and know how to talk about that without shame, without going, oh, I didn't know how to say it, but I wanted him to like me, or I wanted her to like me. And this part felt good, but this part didn't feel good. And I'm confused about that. And then it got too far and I wasn't ready.
That is I haven't actually thought of that, but it's so true because, as a woman, I guess maybe more our generation, I'm not so sure about the younger generations now, but we're taught to be coy and, women aren't necessarily out there flaunting their things. So it was sort of playing a hard to get sort of kind of scenario. And you're not supposed a real classy woman isn't going to necessarily say like, yeah, I definitely want to have sex. I'm totally into that. And you're supposed to pull back a little bit and make that man or woman reach a little bit more to get to that. So yeah, perhaps I think there is, I don't know, now more of an open conversation happening where people do feel more comfortable. It's not quite such a societal taboo to talk for, especially women, to talk about their sexuality.
What's really interesting is that every Christmas, or like at least for the last 5 to 10 years, it's been in my world for like 20, 25 years. But the song Baby It's Cold Outside comes up. And the 10, 15, 20 years ago when I said, this is a date rape song, people are like, you're just, overreacting, Tracy, you do these things. And then, it got into common misconception, or not misconception, but like people started talking about this being a date rape song of, what's in my drink. The actual original version of that song, I think, was made in the 30s or 40s. And they did it that way because it was supposed to be really tongue in cheek, because she wanted to be wanted what happened. She wanted to have sex, but because women weren't allowed to have sex and to like sex, she had to say, oh, wait, I pretended to say no. So then that I wasn't the slut and people wouldn't talk, and so it was seen as a song for female empowerment of this was how you got what you want sexually. And within 50 years the culture shifts and we see it as a date rape. But I think that also shows the progression of what we're talking about, of what once women had to do because they weren't allowed to like sex, or sex was just after marriage, all of this stuff, even though we know that so much sex was happening before marriage. And to the point of like, look, this is now creepy. The same thing that was empowering is now creepy because our culture shifted, which is important. And now we need to shift again.
Right. I mean, all these shifts are great. And some of the labels are great too, because I think it raises awareness. It raises the awareness of the need of further education and diving into things. So what happens now? The sexual violence has occurred, and now that victim, survivor, however they want to define themselves, is living with the aftermath. What kind of trauma is felt? I mean, I'm sure there's a varying degree of what happens.
I think first of all, I want to say that every survivor is unique. So whatever you experienced is real for you. But I think that there are a lot of commonalities over the years that I've witnessed from talking to thousands of survivors. And there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of shame. There's a lot of, I thought I would fight, but I didn't. I froze. And they don't understand that freeze is a biological trauma response that they can't control in their body. And so they feel like, well, maybe I wanted it, or maybe I didn't do enough to stop it. And so there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of confusion when you didn't know the person, or when you did know the person, and you're like, but I trusted this person. What do I do now? Especially if they're a significant other, or if you're married, or even if you're at the beginning part of a relationship. So I think that where the trauma intensifies is if you disclose to somebody that's close to you and whether or not they believe you. That changes your level of trauma, or it can change your level of trauma to be even more traumatizing. So if you tell your best friend and they be like, but he wouldn't do that. What did you do? Or you tell your parent and to say, oh, they can't hear it because maybe they've been traumatized. You tell the police and the police say, well, what were you wearing? Which is still very common. Or you're married, that can't happen, whatever the case may be. And that adds another level of trauma, because you've had this thing happen to you and now nobody's believing you. And so you feel crazy. You feel like maybe I was to blame, and you live with that, and that settles into your body, and that settles into your stress, and you can have a lot of different stress reactions. Some people laugh, some people just get really giddy and they laugh. Some people shut down, they're depressed, they can't function. Some people overfunction, they become avid runners, they become workaholics, they become whatever, to just like try not to think about it, when all there is, it's still living in your body. And I think that trauma of experiencing the re-traumatization by the systems that are meant to help, that often don't help and often just re-traumatize, is worse for survivors. And I hope that changes, but we're not there yet by any means. You can see Epstein is in the news all of the time. His survivors are still not experiencing justice. You can see that with the Diddy trial. Like, we have video evidence of things, and the systems still aren't working for survivors. But survivors who experience belief when they tell somebody have a different sense of healing.
Yeah, and I think that there's so many contradictory expectations placed on victims too of, you need to say something, but then if it's taken them 5 years or 10 years or 15 years to finally speak out and say, okay, this happened to me, then there's the question of, well, why did it take you so long? So almost that expectation of, maybe you should have just stayed silent. If you stayed silent for this long, then why are you saying something now? Is it because you want money? Is it because you want fame? Are you jumping on the Me Too bandwagon? And yes, just so many different layers of opportunities to get re-traumatized.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and some people go back to that person who abused them and who raped them because they're trying to figure it out. Our brain, when we get traumatized, we relive it, and we're trying to master that trauma. We're trying to master control of what happened to us. And so a lot of times you go back and you have sex with that person again, and maybe it's consensual this time because you want to own it and you want to have the power in that when it was taken from you in the beginning. And so that's really common, is to go back and have sex with that same person, or to have sex with multiple people, because you feel, especially if, and I don't subscribe to the notion that virginity is taken, or that virginity is even necessarily a thing. It's either you've had sex or not, because I think that hurts our understanding of all of this. But if that was the case, and you think, well, I'm broken now because society says I'm broken, which is untrue, then you go on to have sex with a lot of different people, because that normalizes it for you. And that's really common too. And so there's no wrong way to react. It is a survivor's responsibility to take ownership for their healing, though.
And healing is such a unique process as well. I've talked to a few people where, the promiscuity, I guess, following a sexually traumatic event, sometimes they look at that as a way of having their own control. If I go ahead and consent to sex to this person, they can't take that non-consensual piece away from me. If I say no and they force themselves on me anyway, now I've lost control. But if I just go ahead and say yes, and to that person and that person and that person, at least I'm having control over saying yes.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that that's really common, is that survivors try to find some way of control. And so some go to, I'm going to have sex with everybody because that's how I feel control. Some go to, I'm going to run 1,000,000 miles a day because then that is control. Some go, like I said, to the workaholic. And some just retreat inside themselves because they can't control anything. And so they don't leave their house and they get really depressed. And some aren't really affected by it either, which I think is a very, very small majority, but I think that happens too. And I don't think that necessarily means that anything's wrong with you either.
Right. And so now I'm very curious about your work with the perpetrators. Do you feel that, I'm sure you heard probably every excuse in every way of avoidance of accountability, but do you think that there was actually any true, I didn't know that I was doing a bad thing?
It's a great question, and one to really, it's difficult to answer. I believe that there is a spectrum of offenders, just like there's a spectrum of victims. And I think we want to put all victims into one category, and I think we want to put all offenders into one category, and they're not. I think that a majority of offenders have some level of manipulation, and I think that a majority of offenders think that they've done nothing wrong because they have used justification and different cognitive distortions to prove what they've done is right. Look, she wanted it. She was playing hard to get. She consented. She said yes. She didn't say no. She didn't do anything. And, or he had an erection, so of course he was into it and it was feeling good for him. So I think that a lot of offenders have completely justified what they've done, or, I knew it wasn't great, but they were too little. They're not going to remember it anyway. Or I did really love this person, or I really respected my student and they were a star. But it's really about how to justify that power and what they're getting over them, and that power dynamic. There are some that are really calculated. I mean, I think about Bill Cosby, how he drugged women to have sex with him. In his fame, he did not need to drug anybody to have sex. It wasn't about sex. It was the power that he had, and it was the whole ritual that he had around all of that. And so I think that there are some really ritualistic offenders that are really, really awful. And then I think that there are assaults that probably happen where it was extremely traumatizing for the survivor. And I'm not minimizing that at all, and that the perpetrator didn't have any idea what they were doing. I think that that's rare. But I still think that that perpetrator didn't check in to see that they actually had consent. I think that in those cases, if you tell that person, hey, you did this wrong and you need to do this better, they will go, oh my goodness, I had no idea, and be very empathetic and go, yep, and this changes their behavior forever. I don't think that is, so I want to be very, 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 very clear, because as soon as you say that out loud, people are going to justify that, oh, that's me. That is me. Because that is the myth of, well, it was just a bad night of sex, which I think is bullshit. So I think that a majority of offenders are manipulative and calculative. And it's about power and control. It is not about sex.
So do you think it's those loopholes and the misunderstanding and the lack of laws in place, plus that manipulation factor for sure, that contribute to how so many perpetrators do get away with their acts?
Yes.
and continue to go on to abuse probably later?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, until I think it was the 90s, most of our rape laws said that you had to yell and fight back in order for it to be considered rape, which we know now from trauma that is not the case. The majority of rapes, the victim freezes. I think that those laws were made by men. And I think, men are a majority of the perpetrators, even when the victim is a man. And I think our whole society has protected perpetrators. You can see it in the fact of Harvey Weinstein had a team of people getting the women to the hotel. He abused the people who and manipulated them and hurt them if they were going to go forward with what happened and tell anybody what happened. He convinced people of like, well, in Hollywood, this is what you're getting into. And if you want to roll in that movie, you're going to have to experience this thing with Harvey Weinstein. Everybody knew it. It was an open secret, and people just accepted that. And so we try to accept it in a way of like, oh, well, she's just sleeping her way to the top, rather than she's being gate-kept from jobs unless she has sex with somebody. We need to, again, flip that narrative of she was abused to he assaulted. And I know I'm using, gender binaries here, but I think that that's the majority of cases that happen, is where the perpetrator is a man and the victim is a woman. But there's a lot of men who've been assaulted as well, and I don't want to minimize that at all. But I think that the culture of our movies is the case of like, I recently read this thing where it said, what's the number one indicator of if a sexual abuse allegation is going to be believed? And that number one indicator is, what is your impression of the perpetrator? So back in the day, we didn't believe Weinstein survivors. We didn't believe Cosby survivors. We didn't believe Epstein survivors, because these men were these charismatic, gregarious, did many really great things. Now, somebody says I'm an Epstein survivor, Weinstein survivor, Cosby survivor. Of course, the belief is automatically there, because now these men have been vilified. And that's the danger of vilifying rapists, because yes, they do need to be, but majority of the time they've done really, really good things. And so it's the entire culture. the joke is connected to the bruise. Cosby used to joke about putting Spanish fly into women's drinks to have sex with them, and it is on his comedy albums in the 60s. And the people laughed, and he was probably able to use that to say, well, look, I didn't do this. They're just they're taking my joke out of context. Everybody laughed at this. So what I'm doing isn't bad. Everybody else thinks, yeah, that's a great idea. Like, they use it to justify that, and they use everybody around them. Say, nobody called me out on that. It's just locker room talk. It's just this. It's just that. I'm not a bad person. And I think that we have a problem calling out people around us. I've called out many people, and it doesn't always go well. But I'm also trained to do it. I'm trained to know the signs. I'm trained to not keep silent. And so it's a lot easier for me when it's not easy for most people, because most people just want to keep the peace, whether that's in a family of like, there's so many situations where, somebody's been molested by somebody in a family and nobody else wants to talk about it. And you just go to the barbecues. Or in the case of marital rape of like, well, he's still part of the family.
Right. And it's so difficult to look at some of these offenders, like you mentioned, these high profile individuals. They have power, they have money, they're good looking, the college students who have, been accused of rape. They're these tremendous athletes. They're wealthy families. They're extremely handsome, they're preppy. They would never have to rape somebody because they can get any person in the world. And I think that's a huge misconception because, again, it ties down to power and control.
Mm-hmm. And I think that I remember talking to a man probably 10 years ago, and this was after there was a big rape case at Vanderbilt University where 4 football players brutally raped a young woman. And it was caught on, I don't know if it was caught on, well, they videotaped it, and there was parts of it caught on security cameras. And I talked with the man that said, but wasn't it maybe just a bad night of sex? Because it was her boyfriend that initiated it, or guy that she was dating. And I said, do you know what happened? Have you looked into what happened? And I'm not going to repeat it here because I don't want to trigger the audience, but it was brutal. And I said, and I explained that to this man, and I said, this was brutal. Is this something of like a bad night of sex? He said, I didn't know. And I'm like, look into it before you ask those questions. Look into the details before you ask those questions, because you're worried about one thing that's not true most of the time. And when you dig into that of what actually happened, where Bill Cosby admitted in a court of law in 2013, I think, that he had drugged women to have sex with them. And it was sealed. Like, they admit it when they have to. Weinstein had a million, that's an exaggeration, but he had so many NDAs. Mm-hmm. And you have an NDA for a reason. And it could be like, oh, because they're going to defame me. That's not the reason.
Right. Well, and you giving that example is just another perfect example of how people expect there has to be some sort of a brutality component for it to be considered an attack or an assault. Mm-hmm. So what do victims and survivors do? How do they fight back? Because there's been leaps and bounds over the last, few decades, but we are still stuck in, this point of, am I going to be believed? What can I do to arm myself? What can I do to fight back?
Yeah, I think survivors need to do what first and foremost makes them safe. And that is going to look different for every survivor in every community. And it also depends on the perpetrator. And so first and foremost, keep yourself safe and do what makes you feel emotionally and physically safe. I think that there are ways, for survivors to make sense of what happened to them in therapy. But I would, if you're going into therapy, get somebody who is very well versed in sexual trauma. Not all therapists are, not all trauma therapists are. And so go to somebody who really understands sexual assault and sexual abuse. EMDR is an excellent therapy to help unlock those traumas and to help get out of that obsessive thinking, and to be able to make sense of it. Because a lot of times survivors don't tell for decades don't tell their significant others for decades, and it's just inside of them. And so I think that healing can really happen. And I think figuring out how to speak out, there's a lot of people that I know that have learned how to speak out, and they're speaking out publicly and they're naming their perpetrator. There can be difficulty with that. And so, sometimes you need to talk to a lawyer before you do that, because there is real threat of defamation. And maybe this is a good segue into Callisto.
I was actually thinking that exact thing.
Yeah,
let's move into talking about Callisto.
Yeah. So one of the things that people can do, especially, so our system, Callisto Vault, is technology that we built to help with a lot of the stuff that I just talked about. Anybody in the U.S. and its territories with a .edu email address has free access. So you can be a student, a professor, an alumni, whatever the case may be. If you have that .edu, you have free access. What you do is, if you're trying to find out if your perpetrator has harmed somebody else, you can go in, create an account, and enter into matching. And to enter into matching, you put the state where the assault occurred, and that is because sexual assault laws vary by state. You put in a unique identifier of the perpetrator. So that perpetrator's social media handles, email address, or phone number. There's about 12 different things that you can put in, and you can put in as many as you know, and as many, like if they've got 4 Instagram accounts, you put in 4 Instagram accounts. And then you consent to be contacted in the event of a match. And so what happens is, again, it's all encrypted, and it's end-to-end encrypted, which means that everything, all the data that you put into it is encrypted before it hits our servers. So it's very secure. And if 2 people put in the same Instagram handle, let's say, there's a match. It's not like a dating site, so you're not notified right away. What happens is we get notified, but we still don't see the perpetrator's information or the survivor's information. That's still encrypted to us. We see the accessibility needs, we see the language needs, we see the state that the assault occurred in, and we assign that case to a confidential advocate who will reach out to the survivors separately, free of charge. So the survivor pays nothing for any of this. The survivor has a choice along the way. So their first choice is to meet with that advocate or not. Do they want to meet with the person? Great. If they do, they set up a Zoom call, and that's protected under confidentiality. And they meet with that person who talks to them about their legal rights, their criminal, what a criminal case may look like, what a civil case may look like, what a Title IX case may look like, what mental health options there are for them, and all of their options. And then if the survivor wants to know and wants to disclose their information to the other survivors who've matched, they sign a consent to do so, and that advocate will work at connecting them. The survivor never has to make that choice, but that is a choice that they can make. And so that advocate will connect the survivors so they can pursue healing and justice, whatever that means to them. We do not report to police. We do not report to Title IX. We do not report to HR. We are not a reporting platform. We also are not a database that people can sort through, and we are not a warning system. And I think that is something really unique. We are an independent, neutral third party that will empower survivors for them to make the best decision for whatever that means for them.
So can a survivor with, no understanding what had happened to them, and they just sort of just want to put it out into the universe and don't necessarily want to follow up on anything, can they just put their information there and never move
Absolutely.
forward?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And a lot of survivors do. We've talked to survivors who typically in the past, their options have been to report or not to report. And some that have reported, most don't ever see justice. They don't see accountability for that perpetrator. And then the other ones are oftentimes left with, did that perpetrator do it to somebody else? I'll report because I want to make sure that they stop and they get held accountable. And so they're left with this wonder of, this person's still out there. I know a lot of survivors who said, I would report, I would do something if I knew I wasn't the only one. And we can see that in Me Too. We can see that's why Harvey Weinstein is in jail. And so, but just the power of saying, I've done something, that somebody else is going to know there's a match, even if I don't ever want to talk to that advocate, I don't ever want to decide. I also think that there are survivors who I'm never going to say it, if there's a match. I don't want to participate in the process if there's a match. I just want to have it live somewhere. And then they get contacted by the advocate and they're like, well, maybe I do want to know more, but I'm not going to I'm not going to know about that person. I'm never going to disclose my identity. Great. If they end there, great. Then they might think about it and go, you know what? I do want to do something. And if they want to, great. If they don't, great. Like we are agnostic about any of it because we believe that survivors can make the best decision for themselves.
I love that because I think that's another one of the expectations on victims and survivors is almost the, okay, something's happened to you. It's now your responsibility to take down that perpetrator and make sure that he or she never offends anyone again. And to live with that, knowing that you have to then go forward with all of these steps and be re-traumatized, re-victimized, whatever, just because you feel this obligation that society's putting on you, that it's now your responsibility to make them stop. So I love that that's an option of being able to put that out there.
And we built it this way because it is not the responsibility of survivors to report. It is not the responsibility of survivors to hold somebody accountable. And if the person who assaulted you is a serial perpetrator and you didn't report, you have no responsibility for the other people who have been assaulted. That is not on you. And I think a lot of survivors do hold that weight, and it is not, because I guarantee you that there are survivors who reported and didn't get justice, and that person still went on to offend. People reported Weinstein. People reported Cosby. People reported Larry Nassar, the USA gymnastics doctor, to police, to Title IX at Michigan State University, and nothing was done. So sometimes if you report or not, it still doesn't matter. And there's a safety level of what happens to you if you do report and you're not believed. And that can be more traumatizing to you. So I hope our systems are different. Right now we're really working on the phase of, because we're still new at this, of survivor empowerment. And we are going to get to accountability, and accountability takes time. And eventually I hope we get to policy change. Because that's the key to preventing all of this in the end anyway, is that those systems do work because we have more data on serial perpetrators, and we understand how these things work, and we understand what survivors need for those to be held accountable.
And thank you for clarifying that, because I don't believe that it's a victim's responsibility either. I just it is almost this unspoken, and sometimes
it's very
sometimes
spoken.
loudly. Yeah,
I think it's very
sometimes
spoken.
very loudly spoken. That it's your responsibility to say something. Quick question specific to Callisto: those advocates that are then contacting these individuals, what credentials do they have? Because that can be a very traumatic experience as well, just to have that contact.
We vet all of them, and they're trauma informed, and we're actually in the process of really securing a partnership where one partner will work with us on that. And but they are advocates who've been doing this work for a long time and understand this work and understand how to be trauma informed and how to put the survivor in the position in the position of power. They're also protected under confidentiality. So whether that's being an attorney or a licensed clinical social worker or whatever, not all states protect all advocates, but a survivor will know that limitation before they ever say a word to anybody, and the advocate still will not say anything. And if we get a subpoena, we'll fight it.
Okay, that was going to be my next question is legally, if there's a subpoena. Okay.
Yeah, right. I mean, right now, we don't have access to the information. So if somebody were to say, can you tell me if this person has created an account? No, I cannot. There is no way for me as the CEO to know that. There's no way for me to get any of that information. The only time that anybody sees the information unencrypted is when there's a match that happens. So if you've not experienced a match, there's no way we can get any of your information. And the only person that sees that information once a match happens is somebody who is legally protected under confidentiality.
Okay, perfect. And how far is your reach with Callisto?
Right now we have accounts created in 49 states. We have about 10% of all schools, all universities in the U.S. have at least one account created. And so we are making traction. We have accounts created at almost 600 schools. And so we are still expanding reach because over 21 million people have free access. So, anybody with that .edu email has free access. And so we have that massive reach, and now it's just about getting people to know about it. And I think that that's a challenge, and that's why I'm super happy to have your platform, and I hope that if all of your audience just tells one person about it, it can be really impactful, because people don't want to follow a organization about sexual assault because it's triggering. Meta blocks our ads, Google blocks our ads, because how do you talk about rape when, people, you'll see it on TikTok of like people using the grape icon and stuff, and our ads get shut down for inappropriate content because we're talking about sexual assault and rape. They get shut down for being political when sexual assault should not be a political issue, but we've made it into a political issue. And so it's really challenging to spread the word, but it's important to. So if you know college students, if you know professors, if you know people, spread the word on college campuses. Connect with us. And we have a free toolkit on our website that people can download, and they can print posters and business cards and everything else and brochures about how it works. We also have a demo coming up in September, or check, depending on when you're listening to this, check our website to see if we have a demo coming up that you can come and ask questions, because there's a lot of questions about this. There's a lot of uncertainty, but we probably have the answer for those questions. And we love to partner with students. We have a student ambassador program where we prepare students to spread the word on their campuses by giving them training and giving them the resources that they need to be able to do this work on college campuses. And of course, somebody's going to believe their peer more than they're going to believe my Gen X face, so it's important that students know about this. And if you don't think that it's going to happen to your child who goes to college, I hope that's the case. But in reality, 1 in 4 women who go to college experience sexual assault. 1 in 5 trans and non-binary students experience sexual assault, and 1 in 15 boys and men experience sexual assault while in college. And so I know a lot of people worry about false reporting, and they're worried about their boys that are going to college being falsely accused. But your son is more likely to be raped in college than they are to be your son is more likely to be sexually assaulted while in college than they are to be falsely accused. And yet we're not talking about the abuse and sexual assault of boys and men on college campuses either.
Are you looking to expand beyond the educational system for those who don't have an affiliation with an educational system?
We are definitely in the process of securing some funding to do that. A lot of it really comes down to funding. Funding in the sexual assault space is fairly complex because people don't want to talk about it. And companies don't want their name attached to it. So we are really working hard on securing funding for a pilot to be able to expand access beyond .edus. If you are somebody out there that is a generous donor or is connected to somebody who's a generous donor, please let me know, and that will speed the process along. But we're hoping to be able to announce something, if not by the end of the year, hopefully early in 2026, to be able to have our plan. But we are actively pursuing that. And so if you're wanting more information, subscribe to our newsletter or follow us at Callisto on Instagram.
Okay, so let's get people connected to you. What are your handles? What's your website?
Mm-hmm. So our website is projectcallisto.org. Callisto is spelled Callisto. Our Instagram handle is @Callisto. You can follow us on LinkedIn. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. We are on Facebook, but not as much, @Callisto.org. We are on X, again, not as much, @Callisto. And so but Instagram is the main place that we're on. So if you want to follow us there, but feel free to reach out. We respond to every email that we get at contact@projectcallisto.org. And we are really looking for new and exciting ways to spread the word and to look for new donors and new funders, and really make sure that college students know that they have access. And one other thing that I want to say about our system is that it doesn't matter who the perpetrator is. The perpetrator does not have to be connected to the school. It can be anybody. So perpetrators are often in communities and may not be a student at the school. We know that students move after they've been assaulted. We know that perpetrators move after being accused of assault. So we have matches that one survivor lives on one coast, one survivor lives on another coast. And so it doesn't matter who the perpetrator is or if they're affiliated with the school or not.
Okay. That was actually a very good point. So finally, I believe every story carries strength. And what would your strength or message that you want to leave be with listeners?
I think to the survivors out there that we believe you, we see you, what you're experiencing is normal, and there is healing that can happen, and healing is a journey, but it's not your fault. It is solely on the perpetrator, and there are people that are fighting every day to make sure that we can hold perpetrators accountable so that story can change.
Thank you so much, Tracy. That's incredible information you've shared. Your time, your expertise, and your message are going to be so powerful. I love everything that you're doing, your advocacy, and all of your work. And I am truly, truly appreciative of you coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
Okay, thanks. Thank you again, Tracy, for joining me today, and thank you, warriors, for listening. I've included the links Tracy was referring to, as well as her 1 in 3 profile link in the show notes. I will be back next week with another episode for you. Until then, stay strong, and wherever you are in your journey, always remember, you are not alone. Find more information, register as a guest, or leave a review by going to the website 1in3podcast.com. That's the number 1, IN, the number 3, podcast.com. Follow 1 in 3 on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at 1 in 3 podcast. To help me out, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. 1 in 3 is a .5 Pinoy production. Music written and performed by Tim Crow.